Jackson Carter stood in the freezing rain for 3 years waiting for this moment, and in a single heartbeat, it shattered his entire world. The German shepherd that had once dragged him through the burning sands of Afghanistan to save his life was now staring at him not with love, but with a cold, primal fury. The dog's lips curled back to reveal teeth that had once guarded Jackson's sleep but now looked ready to tear his throat out. Jackson fell to his knees in the mud, reaching out with trembling hands, hoping it was a mistake, but the low guttural growl that vibrated through the iron gate confirmed his worst nightmare. The hero dog he remembered was gone, and something terrifying had taken its place. But as Jackson looked closer into those amber eyes, he saw something that froze his blood. The dog wasn't just angry, it was terrified, and that terror was the first clue to a conspiracy so dark it would make the war zone look like a playground. The cold rain slashed sideways against the imposing iron gates of the Sterling estate, turning the driveway into a river of dark mud. Jackson pulled his worn military jacket tighter around his chest, but the dampness had already soaked through to his bones. It was a bitter night in the outskirts of Seattle, the kind of weather that made his old shrapnel wounds ache with a dull, throbbing rhythm. But Jackson didn't care about the pain. He didn't care that he had spent his last $20 on gas just to get here, or that he looked like a beggar standing outside a palace. He checked his watch for the 10th time in a minute. It was 9 o'clock. The fundraising gala inside the mansion was winding down. He could hear the faint sound of classical music drifting from the glowing windows, mixed with the polite laughter of people who had never known what it was like to sleep in a trench. Jackson shifted his weight from one boot to the other, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Tonight was the night. After 2 years of fighting the bureaucracy of the adoption agencies, and after endless letters to Councilman Sterling pleading for a visitation, he had finally been granted 5 minutes. 5 minutes to see the only soul who had ever truly understood him. 5 minutes to reunite with Gunner. He closed his eyes, and for a second, he wasn't in the cold rain anymore. He was back in the heat of the Kandahar Valley, feeling the rough fur of a Belgian Malinois pressed against his leg. He could smell the dust and the fear, but he felt safe because Gunner was there. Gunner was always there. The sound of the electronic gate buzzing broke his reverie. The heavy iron bars groaned as they swung open slowly. A tall figure emerged from the shadows holding a large black umbrella. It was Councilman Sterling. He looked exactly like he did on the campaign posters, impeccable in a tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the wind. But Jackson didn't look at the man. His eyes dropped instantly to the leash in Sterling's hand, and there at the end of the leather strap was Gunner. Jackson felt his breath hitch in his throat. The dog looked older. His muzzle was dusted with gray, and he moved with a stiffness that hadn't been there before. Around his neck sat a thick leather collar studded with rhinestones that glittered under the security lights. It looked ridiculous on a war dog, a mockery of the warrior he used to be. But it was him. It was Gunner. Gunner Jackson choked out his voice, cracking. He dropped to his knees in the mud, ignoring the water soaking into his jeans. He opened his arms wide, his face wet with rain and tears. "It's me, buddy. It's Jax. Tango Mike Gunner. Tango Mike." That was their code. Tango Mike. Target marked. It was the phrase that used to send Gunner bounding into action, tail wagging furiously, ready to work or play. Jackson waited for the impact. He waited for the familiar weight of 80 pounds of muscle launching into his chest. He waited for the rough tongue licking the salt off his face. He waited for the happy whimper that meant he was home. But the impact never came. Instead, a sound tore through the night air that made Jackson's blood turn to ice. It was a growl, deep, menacing, vibrating with a ferocity that Jackson had only ever heard directed at enemy combatants. Gunner lunged forward, but not to hug. He lunged to strike. The leash snapped taut, choking the dog back as he snapped his jaws inches from Jackson's face. Jackson froze, his arms still open, his heart shattering into a million pieces. Gunner's ears were pinned flat against his skull. His hackles were raised, forming a rigid ridge of fur along his spine. But it was the eyes that haunted Jackson. Those amber eyes that used to look at him with absolute adoration were now wide-blown and wild. The pupils were dilated so large they almost swallowed the iris. Easy Gunner Jackson whispered, his voice trembling, "It's me. Look at me. Gunnar didn't stop. He barked a sharp, aggressive sound that echoed off the stone walls of the mansion. He strained against the collar, coughing as it dug into his throat, desperate to get at Jackson. Councilman Sterling pulled the leash back with a look of distaste, curling his lip. I told you this was a bad idea, Sterling said, his voice smooth and dismissive. He's not the dog you remember, Mr. Carter. He's old. His mind is going. He gets confused. No, Jackson stammered, standing up slowly, his legs shaking. He knows me. He never forgets a scent. We were together for 3 years. He saved my life. Well, tonight he looks like he wants to end it, Sterling said, checking his expensive watch. Look at him. He's distressed. You're upsetting him. I think it's best if you leave. Jackson looked at Gunnar again, searching for any sign of recognition, any flicker of the bond that had kept them both alive when the world was exploding around them. But all he saw was a stranger, a dangerous, violent stranger trapped in the body of his best friend. Gunnar let out another snarl, saliva dripping from his bared teeth. Please, Jackson begged, stepping forward. Just let me touch him. Let him smell my hand. Get back. Sterling snapped, stepping between them. If he bites you, I'll have to put him down. Is that what you want? Do you want to be the reason he dies? The threat hit Jackson like a physical blow. He stopped dead in his tracks. The rain poured down harder, washing away the hope he had carried for so long. He looked at Gunnar one last time. The dog was panting heavily now, his eyes darting frantically from side to side, never settling on Jackson for more than a second. It was as if he couldn't bear to look at him. Go home, mister. Carter, Sterling said, turning his back and dragging the resisting dog toward the house. You're a disturbed man. You're disturbing my peace. Don't come back. The gate began to close with a mechanical whine. Jackson stood there paralyzed, watching the two figures disappear into the shadows of the estate. The last thing he heard before the heavy iron clanged shut was Gunnar's bark. It wasn't a bark of anger anymore. It sounded like a scream. Jackson climbed into the cab of his rusted pickup truck, his movements mechanical and numb. He slammed the door, shutting out the roar of the rain, but he couldn't shut out the image of Gunnar's bared teeth. He turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life, coughing and wheezing like a dying animal. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as he stared out into the darkness. He didn't drive right away. He couldn't. His body was shaking violently, partly from the cold, but mostly from the shock. He leaned his forehead against the wheel and let out a scream of pure agony. It was a raw, guttural sound that had been building inside him since the moment he stepped off the plane 2 years ago without his partner. Why, he sobbed, hitting the dashboard with his fist. Why didn't you know me? The windshield wipers slashed back and forth, keeping time with the chaotic rhythm of his thoughts. Flashbacks hit him in waves, forcing him to close his eyes. He was back in the Humvee. The heat was suffocating. The smell of diesel and sweat filled his nose. Gunnar was sitting in the back seat, alert, his ears twitching at every vibration. Suddenly, the world turned white. The deafening boom of the IED lifted the heavy armored vehicle into the air like a toy. Then silence. Ringing silence. Jackson remembered waking up in the dirt, his leg pinned under twisted metal. He couldn't breathe. The smoke was thick, choking him. He thought he was dead. Then he felt it. A wet nose pushing against his cheek. He opened his eyes and saw Gunnar. The dog was bleeding from a cut above his eye, but he wasn't leaving. He was digging frantically at the dirt beneath Jackson, trying to create space. He remembered the sound of Gunnar whining, a high-pitched sound of worry. He remembered grabbing the dog's collar, using it to pull himself inch by inch out of the wreckage. Gunnar hadn't let go. He had pulled until his paws were raw. And when the medics finally arrived, Gunnar stood over Jackson's broken body, growling at anyone who came too close until he realized they were there to help. That was loyalty. That was love. That dog would have walked through fire for him. Jackson opened his eyes abruptly, pulling himself back to the cold, rainy reality of Seattle. He looked at his own reflection in the rearview mirror. Hollow eyes, unshaven face, a scar running down his jawline. Maybe Sterling was right. Maybe he was a disturbed man. Maybe he had changed so much that even Gunnar couldn't recognize the broken shell of the soldier he used to be. He put the truck in gear and pulled away from the mansion, leaving his heart behind the iron gates. The The drive home was a blur of neon lights and rain-slicked pavement. Every time he stopped at a red light, he looked at the empty passenger seat. It had been empty for too long. He had bought this truck thinking that one day Gunnar would sit there, head out the window, tongue lolling in the wind. Now that dream felt like a cruel joke. The pain in his chest was physical, a heavy, crushing weight. He had survived the war, but he wasn't sure he could survive this. The rejection felt worse than any bullet. It felt like he had been erased. If the one creature who knew his soul looked at him with hatred, then maybe there was nothing left of Jackson Carter worth saving. He pulled into the parking lot of his apartment complex, a rundown building with peeling paint and flickering lights. He killed the engine and sat in the silence, listening to the rain tap against the roof. He felt utterly alone. But as he sat there, a small detail from the encounter began to surface in his mind. A detail he had missed in the heat of the moment. Jackson closed his eyes, trying to visualize Gunnar again. He saw the teeth. He heard the growl. But then he saw the tail. He opened his eyes and stared into the darkness. The tail. He scrambled out of the truck and ran up the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment, taking them 2 at a time. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice before finally unlocking the door. The apartment was small and sparse. A mattress on the floor, a table with 1 chair, and a wall covered in maps and photos. Jackson didn't turn on the light. He went straight to the old footlocker at the end of his bed. He threw it open and dug through his old uniforms, pushing aside medals and letters until he found what he was looking for. A stack of photos. Gunnar and him in the desert. Gunnar sleeping on his cot. Gunnar playing tug-of-war with a rope. And one photo specifically Gunnar attacking a training dummy. Jackson held the photo under the street lamp glow coming through the window. In the picture, Gunnar was in full attack mode. His body was a straight line of aggression, his ears were forward, and his tail. His tail was held high, stiff, and proud like a flag. A dominant dog, a confident dog, a dog that wants to kill holds his tail high. Jackson dropped the photo and paced the small room, his mind racing. He thought back to the mansion. He replayed the scene in slow motion. Sterling pulling the leash, Gunnar lunging, the growl, but the tail. Gunnar's tail hadn't been high. It had been tucked so tight between his hind legs it was almost pressed against his belly. Jackson stopped pacing. He ran a hand through his damp hair. A dog doesn't tuck its tail when it wants to attack. It tucks its tail when it is terrified, when it is submissive, when it is trying to make itself small. Gunnar hadn't been attacking him. Gunnar had been cowering. But why would he growl if he was scared? Why would he snap his jaws? Jackson grabbed another photo. This one was close-up of Gunnar's face. He looked at the eyes. Intelligent, calm, soulful. Then he remembered the eyes he saw tonight. Dilated, black holes of panic. That wasn't dementia. That wasn't old age. Jackson walked over to the window and looked out toward the distant lights of the city, toward where Sterling's mansion sat on the hill. Dogs don't forget scents. Even after years, they know their pack. Gunnar knew him. Jackson felt it in his gut. The growl wasn't natural. It was forced. It was a performance, or a reaction to something else. He remembered Sterling's hand on the leash, the way he held it, not loose like a pet owner, but tight, white-knuckled, and the collar. That ridiculous diamond collar. It was too thick, too wide for a simple decorative piece. Jackson felt a surge of adrenaline replace the despair. The tears on his face dried tight against his skin. He wasn't crazy, and Gunnar wasn't senile. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong at that mansion. He walked to the wall and pinned the photo of Gunnar right in the center. He looked at the dog's face, the brave, loyal partner who had never let him down. "You didn't reject me," Jackson whispered to the empty room, his voice hardening into steel. "You were warning me." He didn't know what was happening behind those iron gates. He didn't know why a councilman would have a terrified war dog, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to leave Gunnar there. Not after tonight. Jackson grabbed his jacket and his keys. The exhaustion was gone. The pain in his leg was forgotten. The soldier was back. He wasn't just a sad veteran anymore. He was a man on a mission. And he was going to find out why his dog was so afraid, even if he had to tear that mansion apart brick by brick. 3 nights later, Jackson lay prone on the muddy ridge overlooking the Sterling estate, his body pressed into the cold earth just like he used to do in the mountains of Kandahar. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating mist that clung to the trees. He raised his old military binoculars to his eyes, adjusting the focus until the blurry lights of the mansion sharpened into clarity. He wasn't looking at the house. He didn't care about the chandeliers or the expensive cars parked in the driveway. His entire world was focused on a structure in the backyard near the edge of the manicured gardens. It was a kennel, but calling it a kennel felt like a lie. It was a glass box. A sleek modern enclosure with floor-to-ceiling tempered glass walls illuminated by harsh clinical strip lighting. It looked less like a home for a hero dog and more like a display case in a high-end museum or perhaps a laboratory. Inside that sterile prison was Gunner. Jackson watched his breath catching in his throat. Gunner wasn't sleeping. It was 3 in the morning, a time when any normal dog would be curled up dreaming of chasing rabbits. But Gunner was moving. He was pacing back and forth along the length of the glass wall. 3 steps forward, turn. 3 steps back, turn. The movement was rhythmic and mechanical, like the pendulum of a clock ticking down to something terrible. Jackson zoomed in closer, his eyes burning from the strain. This wasn't just restlessness. He had seen this behavior before in zoo animals trapped in cages that were too small and creatures that had lost their minds from isolation. Gunner's head hung low, his tail tucked tight against his legs. He didn't sniff the ground. He didn't look at the moths fluttering against the glass. He just walked a ghost haunting his own life. Seeing his partner like this hurt more than the rejection at the gate. At the gate there had been fire and anger. Here there was only emptiness. It was as if the dog's soul had been hollowed out, leaving only a shell that kept moving because it didn't know how to stop. Jackson bit his lip, tasting copper. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run down that hill and smash the glass with his bare hands, but he forced himself to stay still. He needed intel. He needed to understand the enemy before he could launch the rescue. Suddenly, the motion sensor lights on the back patio flooded the lawn with blinding white brilliance. Jackson froze, blending into the mud. The sliding glass door of the mansion opened and a figure stepped out. It was Councilman Sterling. Even at this hour, he looked composed, wrapped in a dark silk robe, a tumbler of amber liquid in one hand. But it was what he held in his other hand that drew Jackson's attention. It was a small black device. It looked like a car key fob or a garage door opener. Sterling walked casually toward the glass enclosure. He didn't hurry. He didn't look like a man coming to check on a beloved pet. He looked like a warden inspecting an inmate. As he approached the glass, Gunner stopped pacing. The dog froze mid-step, his body going rigid. Even from 300 yards away, Jackson could see the tension rippling through Gunner's muscles. The dog wasn't wagging his tail. He wasn't barking a greeting. He was trembling. Jackson watched, waiting for Sterling to speak. He expected a command, a shout, a whistle, anything that a handler uses to communicate with his dog. In the military, commands were a language of trust, a bond. But Sterling didn't open his mouth. He didn't even look Gunner in the eye. Instead, he simply raised the small black device and pressed a button with his thumb. The reaction was instantaneous and horrifying. Gunner dropped. He didn't just sit. He collapsed into a sitting position so fast it looked unnatural, as if his strings had been cut. His head snapped up, eyes locked on Sterling, but his body was shaking violently. Jackson lowered the binoculars for a split second, blinking in confusion. What was that? That wasn't a sit command. That was a physical reaction. He raised the lenses again just in time to see Sterling take a sip of his drink and press a different button on the remote. Gunner immediately threw himself onto his belly in a down position, but it wasn't the relaxed down of a resting dog. His paws were splayed out, his chin pressed into the concrete floor of the cage, his ears flattened so tight against his skull they practically disappeared. It looked painful. It looked like he was trying to merge with the floor to escape something. Sterling smiled. It was a cold, satisfied smile that sent a shiver down Jackson's spine. The man tapped the glass with his ring, a sharp metallic sound that echoed in the night air, then turned and walked away. As he retreated, he pressed the first button again. Gunner shot back up into a sitting position, rigid as a statue, and stayed there watching Sterling disappear back into the house. Jackson lowered the binoculars, his hands shaking with a mixture of rage and realization. That wasn't training. That was domination. Sterling wasn't giving commands, he was transmitting them. Electronic collars were common tools. Jackson knew that. They used them for boundary training, sometimes a vibration or a mild static shock to correct behavior. But this was different. A dog doesn't drop like a stone from a mild vibration. A war dog toughened by explosions and gunfire doesn't tremble in terror from a static shock. Whatever signal that remote was sending it was powerful enough to bypass Gunner's will entirely. It was control. Absolute terrifying control. Jackson stared at the glass box where Gunner still sat like a statue waiting for a release command that never came. The dog stared out into the darkness, and for a moment it felt like he was looking right at the hill, right at Jackson. "Why use a remote?" Jackson whispered to the wet grass. "Why not use your voice? Unless you can't. Unless the dog hates you so much that he won't listen to a word you say, so you have to force him. Or unless you need to control him silently. Without words. Without anyone else knowing what you're asking him to do." A cold dread settled in Jackson's stomach, heavier than the rain-soaked clothes on his back. Sterling wasn't just a bad owner. He was a man who needed a dog that operated like a machine, a remote-controlled weapon. But for what? Why would a wealthy politician need a combat-capable dog that he could control with the push of a button? Jackson looked at the remote in his memory. It wasn't a standard training collar remote. It had too many buttons. And the way Gunner reacted, it wasn't just pain. It was fear of what came next. The light in the glass cage flickered, and Gunner finally slumped from his rigid sit, resuming his endless mechanical pacing. 3 steps turn. 3 steps turn. Jackson crawled backward down the ridge until he was out of sight. He wiped the mud from his face, but he couldn't wipe away the image of that black remote. He knew now that he wasn't just dealing with an animal abuse case. He was dealing with something calculated, something technical. Sterling was treating a living, breathing hero like a piece of programmable hardware. "I'm coming for you, buddy," Jackson whispered into the dark, his voice fierce with a promise he intended to keep or die trying. He scrambled down the hill toward his truck, his mind racing. He needed to get closer. He needed to see what was on that collar, and he needed to know what else that remote could do. Because if Sterling could drop an 80-pound Malinois with the twitch of a thumb, he was hiding a power that shouldn't exist in a suburban backyard. The surveillance was over. The mission had just begun. The witching hour had settled over the Sterling estate, burying the world in a silence so deep it felt heavy. Jackson shifted his weight on the ridge, trying to blink away the grit and exhaustion stinging his eyes. It was 3 in the morning, the time when the world was supposed to be dead asleep. But down in the glass prison, Gunner was still awake. He had stopped pacing for a moment, standing rigid in the center of his enclosure, his ears swiveling like radar dishes toward the long, winding driveway that led up to the mansion. Jackson frowned, pressing the binoculars tighter against his face. He hadn't heard anything. No engine, no tires on gravel. But he knew better than to doubt a Malinois' senses. If Gunner was listening to something, it was there. Then 2 beams of light cut through the mist. A vehicle was approaching, moving slow and dark up the service road that ran parallel to the main gate. It wasn't a luxury sedan or a guest arriving late from the gala. It was a box truck. Matte black, no chrome, no logos. And as it turned under the security lights, Jackson saw the empty space where a license plate should have been. His military training kicked into overdrive. Unmarked vehicles at 3 in the morning didn't deliver groceries. They delivered trouble. The truck rolled to a stop near the rear loading dock of the warehouse adjacent to the kennels. The engine died. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Gunner barked. It wasn't the frantic, aggressive snarl Jackson had heard at the gate. It wasn't the terrified yelp of a beaten animal. It was controlled, precise. Woof, woof, woof. Silence. Woof, woof, woof. Jackson froze his breath, catching in his throat. He counted the seconds in the silence. 1, 2, 3. Then Gunner repeated it. 3 short, sharp barks. A 3-second pause. 3 short, sharp barks. The sound triggered a memory so vivid it nearly knocked the wind out of Jackson. He was back in the dust of a village outside Kabul, huddled behind a crumbling wall while Gunner watched the perimeter. That rhythm. That wasn't just a dog barking at a stranger. That was the alert signal for unknown presence approaching perimeter. It was a cadence they had drilled into Gunner for months. It was meant to alert the handler without giving away their exact position with continuous noise. He remembers. Jackson whispered into the dark, his heart hammering against his ribs. He's not senile. He's working. Gunnar was signaling him, or he was signaling anyone who would listen. He was telling them that an intruder was on the wire. Jackson watched as two men stepped out of the truck. They were dressed in dark coveralls, wearing tactical gloves. They didn't speak. They moved with the efficiency of soldiers or mercenaries. They walked to the back of the truck and rolled up the door. Jackson had to see what was in that truck. The binoculars weren't enough. The angle was bad, obscured by the corner of the kennel. He needed to get closer. He slid backward down the ridge, moving on his belly through the wet grass. His old injuries screamed in protest, but he ignored them. He was operating on muscle memory, now moving silent and low. He reached the perimeter fence, a chain-link barrier hidden behind a row of thick hedges. He crawled through a gap in the hedge, pressing his face against the cold metal links. He was only 50 yards away now. He could hear the heavy thud of boots on concrete. The men were unloading crates. They weren't standard wooden shipping crates. These were metallic silver reinforced with heavy latches. They looked like transport cases for sensitive equipment or munitions. Gunnar was still barking. 3 barks, silence. 3 barks. He was staring directly at the men, his body a statue of disciplined warning. One of the men stopped wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked toward the kennel and spat on the ground. "Shut that mud up or I will," he hissed. The other man laughed a low, dry sound. "Let him bark. The boss likes him feisty. Besides, he's the only security system that doesn't leave a digital footprint." Jackson's grip on the fence tightened until his fingers turned white. They weren't just delivering cargo. They were talking about Gunnar as if he were part of the infrastructure, a tool. Suddenly, a beam of light swept across the grass inches from Jackson's face. He dropped flat, burying his nose in the dirt, holding his breath. A security guard had appeared from around the corner of the warehouse, flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Did you hear something?" the guard asked, his voice tense. "Probably just a deer," the man by the truck replied, slamming a crate onto a dolly. "Or maybe your ghosts are back. Just load the cargo. We're on a timeline." The flashlight beam swung back and forth, searching the hedge line. Jackson lay motionless, his heart pounding so hard he was sure they could hear it. The beam passed over him once, twice. It lingered on the gap in the hedge where he had crawled through. Jackson's hand moved slowly to the small knife in his boot. He wasn't looking for a fight, not here, not now, but he wouldn't be taken quietly. The guard took a step toward the fence, his hand resting on his holster. "Check it out," the man by the truck ordered. The guard grunted and began walking across the lawn, his boots crunching on the wet grass. He was coming straight for Jackson. Jackson braced himself, preparing to spring up and run. He calculated the distance to the tree line, 30 yards. He could make it if he was fast, but if he ran, he would blow his cover. They would know someone was watching. The guard was 10 feet away, 5 feet. Suddenly, Gunnar changed his tune. The rhythmic warning bark stopped. Instead, he let out a ferocious, chaotic snarl and threw himself against the glass wall of his cage with a deafening thud. The guard jumped, spinning around his flashlight beam, jerking away from the fence and focusing on the kennel. "Damn crazy dog," the guard cursed, backing away. "He's gonna break that glass one day." "Ignore him," the man at the truck shouted. "He's just reacting to the smell of the product. Get over here and help me lift this." The guard hesitated, glancing one last time at the darkness where Jackson lay hidden, then turned and jogged back to the truck. Jackson exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for a lifetime. He looked at Gunnar. The dog was standing against the glass chest, heaving, watching the guard move away. He did that on purpose, Jackson realized. He created a diversion. Gunnar had seen the guard approaching the fence. He had sensed Jackson's danger, and he had switched from a warning signal to a distraction to save his handler. Tears pricked Jackson's eyes, hot and stinging. The bond wasn't broken. It was buried under layers of fear and trauma, but it was still there. Gunnar was still protecting him. The men finished unloading the crates, pushing them into the warehouse. They rolled the truck door down, climbed back into the cab, and reversed out of the driveway, disappearing into the night as quickly and silently as they had arrived. The guard did one last sweep of the area, then went inside. Silence returned to the estate. Jackson slowly pushed himself up from the dirt. He was shaking, but not from the cold. He was shaking from the terrifying realization of what he had just witnessed. Unmarked trucks, metallic crates, men who talked about timelines and products, and a dog who was signaling danger in military code. This wasn't just a bad adoption, this was an operation. Jackson looked at Gunner one last time. The dog had returned to the center of the cage, watching the spot where Jackson was hidden. He gave one single soft woof, a confirmation. "I heard you, Buddy," Jackson whispered into the shadows. "I heard you loud and clear." He slipped back through the hedge and melted into the darkness of the woods. He had seen enough to know that going to the police with just a story about a sad dog wouldn't work. He needed proof. He needed to know what was in those crates, and he needed to know why a powerful politician was smuggling cargo at 3 in the morning using a war hero's dog as a cover. The stakes had just gone up, and Jackson knew he was running out of time. The darkness didn't just fall over the Sterling estate the following night, it suffocated it. The heavy cloud cover blocked out the moon, leaving the sprawling grounds wrapped in a shroud of ink and silence. Jackson moved through the shadows like a ghost. He had spent the last 24 hours mapping the perimeter, finding the blind spots in the security cameras, and timing the patrol intervals of the guards. He wasn't just a concerned pet owner anymore. He was a Marine on a reconnaissance mission, and his objective was behind enemy lines. He slipped through a gap in the ornamental hedge, his boots making no sound on the damp grass. The air was cold, biting at his exposed skin, but he didn't feel it. His adrenaline was a slow-burning fire, keeping him focused, keeping him warm. He crept closer to the warehouse, keeping low, using the shadows of the manicured topiaries for cover until he was within 10 feet of the glass enclosure. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear, but from a desperate, aching hope. He needed to see Gunner up close. He needed to look into his eyes without the rain and the anger and the distance. He needed to know if his best friend was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the trauma. Jackson reached the edge of the glass wall and crouched, pressing his hand against the cold surface. Inside, the lighting had been dimmed to a low blue-hued night mode, giving the enclosure an eerie underwater feel. Gunner was there. He wasn't pacing tonight. He was standing in the center of the cage, facing the glass directly in front of where Jackson was hiding. It was as if he had been waiting, as if he had sensed Jackson's presence the moment he crossed the property line. Jackson slowly rose from his crouch, revealing himself. He held his breath, bracing himself for the bark. He expected the alarm. He expected Gunner to lunge at the glass, to snarl, to give away his position to the guards. Jackson's muscles coiled, ready to bolt at the first sound of aggression, but silence stretched out between them, heavy and thick. Gunner didn't bark. He didn't growl. He didn't even move. He stood statue still, his ears pricked forward, his amber eyes locked onto Jackson's face. Jackson stepped closer until his nose was almost touching the glass. He raised a trembling hand and pressed his palm against the pane. "It's me, Buddy," he mouthed silently, the words forming a fog on the glass. "I'm here." What happened next broke Jackson's heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. Gunner's posture crumbled. The rigid aggression, the stiffness, the mechanical tension, it all melted away. The dog lowered his head, his ears drooping back. He took a single step forward and pressed his nose against the glass directly opposite Jackson's hand. And then Jackson saw it. A tear, a single track of moisture glistening on the fur beneath Gunner's eye. Dogs weren't supposed to cry tears of emotion, science said. It wasn't possible, but Jackson knew what he was seeing. It was a look of such profound sorrow and relief that it hit him harder than a physical blow. Gunner whimpered. It was a sound so faint it barely penetrated the thick safety glass, a high-pitched, broken sound that sounded like a child crying for its parent. Jackson choked back a sob, wiping his own eyes. "I'm going to get you out of here, Gunner. I promise. Just hold on." But Gunner didn't just want comfort. He pulled his head back, his expression shifting from sadness to intense focus. The dog looked deep into Jackson's eyes, searching for that old connection, that telepathic link they had shared in the desert. Then Gunner lifted his right front paw. Jackson frowned. Was he asking to shake hands? It was a trick Jackson had taught him years ago, a way to decompress after a mission. But Gunner didn't offer his paw. Instead, he curled it slightly and brought it down against the glass. Clack! The sound of the claw hitting the glass was sharp and deliberate. Gunner paused. He looked at Jackson to make sure he was watching. Then he did it again. Clack, clack, clack. 3 sharp taps. A pause. clack, clack, clack. 3 more taps. A pause. Clack, clack, clack. S. O.S. Jackson froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. That wasn't a random scratching. That wasn't a dog begging to be let out. That was universal. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. Gunner was signaling distress. But he didn't stop there. The dog took a breath, his eyes never leaving Jackson's, and began a different rhythm. Clack, pause, clack, clack. He waited. Clack, pause, clack, clack. Jackson's mind raced back to the training barracks, back to the survival schools, where they learned how to communicate when silence was the only option. It wasn't Morse code, it was the tap code. The grid system used by prisoners of war in Vietnam to communicate through cell walls. It was a complex system, one that Jackson had practiced absent-mindedly on his leg during long patrols with Gunner, watching him head cocked, listening to the rhythm. He never thought the dog understood the syntax, but dogs understood patterns. They understood rhythm. Gunner tapped again. 1 tap, 4 taps. That was the letter T. He shifted his paw. 4 taps, 2 taps, R, 1 tap, 1 tap, A, 3 taps, 5 taps, P, T, R, A, P, trap. Jackson stared at the dog, his mouth falling open in horror and awe. SOS trap. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. Gunner wasn't senile. He wasn't confused. He was hyper-aware. He was signaling that the situation was a setup. That the cage wasn't just a cage, it was a snare. And then Gunner did something that confirmed Jackson's darkest fears. He lifted his chin, exposing his throat. He tapped the thick leather collar with his claw once, then looked at Jackson with wide, terrified eyes. He tapped the collar again. Then he looked at the door of the cage and shook his head. He was telling Jackson not to open it. He was saying that the collar was the trap. Jackson felt a wave of nausea. He looked at the collar properly for the first time. Beneath the rhinestones, beneath the expensive leather, there was a bulkiness to it. A small boxy shape molded into the side that rested against the jugular. It wasn't a GPS tracker. It wasn't a bark limiter. It was a kill switch. Gunner wasn't growling at Jackson at the gate because he had forgotten him. He was growling to push him away. He was acting aggressive to keep Jackson from coming closer, to keep Jackson from trying to take him, because if Jackson tried to remove him, the collar would do something terrible. Gunner had been protecting him. This whole time, the dog had been suffering, living in isolation, acting the part of a vicious beast, just to keep his master deferred from the people who held the remote. Jackson pressed his forehead against the cold glass, his tears flowing freely now. "You genius," he whispered, his voice trembling with rage and love. "You absolute genius. You saved me again." Gunner lowered his paw and pressed his forehead against the glass mirroring Jackson. For a moment they stayed like that, 2 soldiers separated by a wall of transparent armor, united by a secret language that no one else could hear. But the moment couldn't last. A beam of light swept across the upper lawn near the house. The patrol was coming back. Gunner's head snapped toward the light. He looked back at Jackson and gave a single soft, low woof. It was a dismissal. "Go." Jackson nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve. He understood the mission now. He couldn't just break the glass and run. If he triggered an alarm, if he tried to force the collar off, he might kill the only thing he had left in this world. This wasn't a smash and grab anymore. This was a bomb defusal. "I'm coming back for you," Jackson promised, his hand lingering on the glass, "and I'm gonna rain hell on them." He turned and slipped back into the shadows, leaving Gunner standing vigil in his glass prison. As Jackson retreated into the darkness of the woods, the rhythmic tapping started again faintly behind him. Clack, clack, clack. A heartbeat in the night, a signal that the fight wasn't over. And for the first time in 2 years, Jackson didn't feel like a broken veteran. He felt like a soldier with a target, and God help anyone who stood in his way. The fluorescent lights of the sheriff's station hummed with a low, maddening buzz that seemed to drill straight into Jackson's skull. He sat on the edge of a hard wooden chair, his leg bouncing nervously, his hands gripping his phone so tight the screen threatened to crack. It had been 45 minutes. 45 minutes of watching officers walk by with their coffees, avoiding his gaze. 45 minutes of being treated like a ghost in the town he had grown up in. Finally, the heavy oak door to the inner office opened. Sheriff Brody stood there. He was a good man, a man Jackson used to respect, a man who had coached his little league team 20 years ago. But today, Brody didn't look like a coach. He looked tired. His uniform was crisp, but his shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. He motioned Jackson inside, not with a wave, but with a weary tilt of his head. Jackson didn't waste time with pleasantries. He marched to the desk and slammed his phone down, sliding it across the polished wood. "Watch it," Jackson said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "Just watch the first 10 seconds. Brody sighed, rubbing his temples as if he were already dealing with a headache. He picked up the phone, holding it at arm's length. On the screen, the shaky footage from the night before played out. The blue-tinted darkness of the glass cage, the silhouette of the dog, and the sound. Clack, clack, clack. Jackson leaned over the desk, pointing at the screen. "There. Did you hear that? 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. That is not a dog scratching for fleas, Brody. That is a rhythm. That is tap code. He is signaling SOS. Brody watched the video for a moment longer, then set the phone down face up. He didn't look impressed. He didn't look shocked. He looked pitying, and that pity was sharper than any insult. "Jackson, listen to yourself," Brody said softly, leaning back in his chair. "You are telling me that a dog, Jackson, is using prisoner of war communication tactics to tell you he is being held hostage by the most respected man in this county. It's not just a dog," Jackson snapped, his frustration boiling over. "It is Gunner. He is a Marine. He knows the code because I taught him the code. We used it in the field. And look at his eyes, Brody. Look at the way he checks the perimeter before he taps. He is terrified." Brody shook his head slowly, opening a manila folder on his desk. Jackson recognized the logo on the paperwork instantly. It was from the Department of Veterans Affairs. It was his medical file. "I made some calls," Brody said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I spoke to your caseworker at the VA. Jackson, you have been through hell. Nobody denies that. The IED, the recovery, the trauma. It messes with a man's head. It makes you see enemies where there are none. It makes you see patterns in the noise." Jackson recoiled as if he had been slapped. "You think I am imagining this? You think I am having an episode? I think you are lonely," Brody said, brutally honest. "I think you miss your dog and you are projecting your own pain onto him. You see him in a cage and you feel trapped, so you think he is trapped too. But he isn't, Jackson. He is living in a heated kennel on a $10 million estate. He eats better than you and I combined. He is being controlled," Jackson shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. "I saw Sterling. I saw the remote. He pressed a button and Gunner dropped like he was shot. It's not a training collar, Brody. It's a torture device." And the truck, the unmarked truck at 3 in the morning. They were unloading crates, heavy crates. What is a politician doing with military-grade transport cases in the middle of the night? Brody's expression hardened. He closed the file with a finality that echoed in the small room. "That is enough. You are talking about Councilman Sterling, the man who funded this station's new equipment, the man who runs the veterans charity that pays for your therapy. You are accusing him of what? Smuggling, animal abuse. Based on what? A blurry video of a dog scratching on glass and the paranoid theories of a man who hasn't held down a job in 2 years. Jackson stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "So that is it. You won't help because he bought you. You are scared of him. I am trying to protect you." Brody stood up too, his height filling the room. "Sterling called me this morning, Jackson. He has security footage of you. He knows you were on his property last night. He knows you were trespassing. He wanted to press charges. He wanted you arrested for stalking and harassment. I talked him down. I told him you were just confused. I told him I would handle it." "Handle it?" Jackson laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "By telling me I am crazy. By telling you to stop." Brody's voice became a command, the sheriff replacing the friend. "This is your one warning, Jackson. If you set foot on that property again, if you go near that fence, if you so much as look at that house through binoculars, I will arrest you. I will revoke your probation, and I will have you committed for psychiatric evaluation. Do you understand me?" Jackson stared at the man he used to trust. He saw the fear in Brody's eyes. It wasn't fear of Jackson, it was fear of the truth. It was the fear of a man who knew something was wrong but was too comfortable to ask questions. "You are making a mistake," Jackson whispered, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "There is something bad happening up on that hill, and when it blows up, it is going to be on your hands." Brody looked away, unable to hold Jackson's gaze. "Go home, Jackson. Take your pills. Get some sleep. Forget the dog. He is gone." Jackson grabbed his phone from the desk. His hand was shaking, but his grip was iron. He turned and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "He is not gone," Jackson said without looking back. "He is waiting for me. And since the law won't help a soldier, I guess the soldier has to help himself." He walked out of the station and into the blinding afternoon sun. The town looked the same. The people looked the same. But everything had changed. The system he had fought for, the laws he had defended, they had all turned their backs on him. He was completely alone, isolated, discredited, a crazy vet with a crazy story. But as he climbed into his truck, he looked at the black screen of his phone. He didn't see a blur. He saw the code. TRAP. Brody was wrong. The VA was wrong. The whole world was wrong. Gunner was alive and he was fighting. And Jackson knew that he was the only reinforcement coming. If he had to become a criminal to save his partner, then so be it. The law ended where the fence line began. Tonight he wasn't going to watch from the hill. Tonight he was going inside. The veterinary clinic on the edge of town was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt more like a sanctuary than a business. The sign out front read Dr. Chen, holistic and general practice, but Jackson knew the woman inside was far more than a small-town vet. Dr. Emily Chen had been a field surgeon for the canine units in Helmand Province. She had stitched up more dogs under mortar fire than most vets did in a lifetime of sterile operating rooms. If anyone could understand what Jackson was saying, it was her. Jackson pushed through the door, the bell chiming softly. Emily was behind the counter reviewing a chart. She looked up, her sharp eyes narrowing as she recognized him. She didn't smile. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply nodded a silent acknowledgement of a shared past. "Jackson?" She said, her voice calm but guarded. "It's been a while. You look like you haven't slept in a week." "I haven't." Jackson replied, his voice raspy. He walked straight to the counter and placed his phone down just as he had with Brody, but this time the desperation in his eyes was met with focus, not pity. "I need you to look at something. Please, don't ask me if I'm off my meds. Just look." Emily studied him for a long moment, assessing him with the same clinical precision she used on her patients. Then she picked up the phone. Jackson played the video of Gunner in the glass cage, the pacing, the tapping, the collar. Emily watched in silence. Her expression didn't change at first, but Jackson saw her grip on the phone tighten. She replayed the video. Then she zoomed in on the collar. She watched it again and again. When she finally looked up, her face was pale. "That's not a training collar," she said softly. "I know," Jackson breathed relief washing over him so intensely he almost collapsed. "Brody said it was a therapeutic device. Sterling said it was for his arthritis." "Arthritis?" Emily scoffed, a flash of anger in her eyes. "Look at the skin around the neck, Jackson." "Right here." She pointed to a blurry frame on the screen. "The fur is gone. The skin is red, almost blistered. That's a contact burn. Electrical or chemical, I can't tell without examining him, but it's constant. That collar isn't treating him. It's hurting him. Every second of every day." He tapped SOS. Jackson said, his voice trembling, and he tapped TRAP. "He told me the collar is the trap." Emily set the phone down gently. She walked around the counter and locked the front door, flipping the sign to closed. Then she turned to Jackson, her demeanor shifting from doctor to soldier. "I believe you," she said. 3 words. Just 3 words, but they were enough to pull Jackson back from the edge of the abyss. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why do you believe me when everyone else thinks I'm crazy?" "Because I know that dog," Emily said, leaning against the counter, crossing her arms. "I treated Gunner after the IED blast that took you out. He had shrapnel in his shoulder burns on his paws. Most dogs would have been in shock, but not him. He was calm. He let me work because he knew he had to get back to you. That kind of intelligence doesn't fade with age, and that kind of loyalty doesn't disappear just because a politician buys him. She paused, looking out the window at the darkening street. And I know Sterling. He brings Gunner here for his annual checkups, but he never lets me examine him alone. His security guards are always in the room. They watch every move I make. And Gunner, he's never happy. He's compliant, robotic. I thought it was just old age or depression. But if he's communicating with you, if he's signaling distress, it's the collar, Jackson interrupted. He's terrified of it. When Sterling touched the remote, Gunner dropped like a stone. Emily's eyes widened. A remote, did it look like a standard e-collar remote numb? It was black, boxy, lots of buttons, not like anything I've seen. Emily paced the small waiting room, her mind working fast. This is bad, Jackson. If that collar is causing burns, it's malfunctioning or it's set to a power level that's illegal. But if it's more than that, if it's what you think it is, she stopped, turning to face him. You're planning to go get him, aren't you? Tonight, Jackson said, his jaw set. I'm going over the wall. You'll get arrested, Emily warned. Or worse, Sterling has private security. They're armed. I don't care, Jackson said. He's my partner. I left him behind once. I'm not doing it again. Emily looked at him, searching for any sign of hesitation. She found none. She sighed, walking to her supply cabinet. She pulled out a small black case and handed it to him. This is a microchip scanner, she said. It also picks up radio frequencies. If that collar is transmitting or receiving a signal, this will tell you the frequency. And this, she handed him a small vial and a syringe, is a sedative, strong enough to knock out a Malinois in 10 seconds. If he panics, if he tries to hurt you because of that collar, you might need it. Jackson took the items, staring at them. You're helping me. I'm helping the dog. Emily corrected, her voice firm. But listen to me, Jackson. This is dangerous. Sterling isn't just a politician. He's powerful. If he's doing something to that dog, something illegal, he won't hesitate to destroy the evidence. And that includes you. I know, Jackson said, pocketing the scanner. But I have to try. Then be smart, Emily said, unlocking the door. Don't just break in. Think like a soldier. Get in, get the proof, and get out. If you bring me evidence, real evidence, I can get a court order. I can get the vet board involved. But without proof, you're just a trespasser. Jackson nodded, stepping out into the cool evening air. He looked back at Emily, the only person in the world who stood by his side. Thank you, Doc, he whispered. Bring him home, Jackson, she replied softly. Bring him home. Jackson walked back to his truck, the weight of the scanner in his pocket heavy and reassuring. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a mission. He had an ally. And tonight, he was going to what to... The silence of the estate was a heavy blanket that Jackson moved through with the practiced ease of a man who had spent half his life hunting in the dark. He had left his truck a mile down the road, hidden beneath the overhanging branches of an old willow tree. He didn't want any engine heat or tire tracks giving him away. This wasn't a visit. This was an extraction. He reached the perimeter wall, the stone rough and cold against his fingertips. He checked his watch. 2 a.m. The witching hour. The guards would be at their lowest alertness, the biorhythms of the human body naturally dipping into fatigue. But Jackson wasn't fatigued. His veins were coursing with a cocktail of adrenaline and rage that sharpened his vision and steadied his hands. He tossed his grappling hook over the wall, the padded claws catching the stone, coping without a sound. He hauled himself up, his muscles screaming in protest, but his mind overruling the pain. He dropped into the garden, landing in a crouch behind a row of sculpted hedges. He scanned the grounds. The security cameras were sweeping in their predictable arcs. He had timed them earlier. He had exactly 12 seconds between sweeps to cross the open lawn to the generator box. He moved, a shadow detaching itself from the darkness. He reached the utility panel and pulled out the small jamming device Dr. Emily had given him. He didn't want to cut the power that would trigger a hard alarm. He just wanted to loop the video feed. He attached the device to the coaxial line, his fingers working with surgical precision. The green light on the jammer blinked once, then turned solid. The cameras were now blind, replaying the last 10 minutes of empty lawn on an infinite loop. Jackson exhaled. Step 1 complete. Now for the hard part. He crept toward the glass kennel, his boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. The structure glowed faintly with that eerie blue nightlight. As he approached, he saw Gunner. The dog was awake, standing in the center of the cage, rigid and alert. His ears were swiveled toward Jackson's position, even though Jackson hadn't made a sound. "Good boy," Jackson whispered into the wind. "You know I'm here." He reached the door of the enclosure. It was secured with a digital keypad. Jackson didn't have the code, but he had something better. He pulled a high-torque bypass tool from his belt, jamming it into the manual override slot beneath the pad. He twisted. There was a sickening crunch of plastic and metal, followed by the soft pneumatic hiss of the seal breaking. The glass door slid open. The smell hit him first. It wasn't the smell of a clean home. It was the smell of ozone chemicals and fear. The air inside the cage was refrigerated unnaturally cold. Jackson stepped inside. Gunner didn't move. He stood facing the back wall, his body trembling so violently that his teeth chattered. He didn't turn to look at Jackson. He didn't acknowledge the open door. It was as if he was paralyzed by an invisible force. Jackson approached him slowly, his hands raised, palms up. "Gunner," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's me. We're leaving." "Come on, buddy." "Tango, Mike. We are leaving." Gunner's head snapped around. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown so large they looked like black holes. He looked at Jackson, and then he looked at the collar. He let out a whine that sounded like a scream trapped in his throat. Jackson saw the collar up close for the first time. It was monstrous. The leather was thick, but beneath it wires pulsed with a faint red light. It was tight, digging into the fur, the skin around it angry and inflamed. Jackson could hear a low, high-pitched hum coming from the device, a frequency barely audible to human ears, but probably sounding like a siren to a dog. "I know," Jackson said, tears stinging his eyes. "I know it hurts. I'm going to take it off." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the sedative syringe Emily had given him. He didn't want to use it, but he couldn't risk the collar triggering if Gunner panicked. "It will be okay," Jackson soothed, stepping closer. "Just a little pinch, and then you sleep. And when you wake up, this thing will be gone." He reached for Gunner's neck. The moment his fingers brushed the cold metal of the collar, Gunner exploded. It wasn't a gradual shift. It was instantaneous. 1 second the dog was trembling in fear. The next he was a blur of violence. Gunner snarled a sound so loud and ferocious it seemed to shake the glass walls. He spun around, snapping his jaws inches from Jackson's face. Jackson stumbled back, dropping the syringe. It shattered on the concrete floor, the clear liquid splashing uselessly. "Gunner!" "No," Jackson shouted, raising his arm to protect his throat. But Gunner wasn't aiming for the throat. He lunged forward, his teeth sinking deep into Jackson's forearm. The pain was blinding. Jackson screamed as the canines tore through his jacket, through his skin, and scraped against the bone. It was real. It was vicious. Blood, warm and sticky, soaked his sleeve instantly. Jackson tried to pull away, but Gunner held fast, growling with a savagery that terrified him. Why, he thought, his mind reeling in shock. "Why are you doing this? I am here to save you." Gunner released the arm only to lunge again. This time he didn't bite. He lowered his head and slammed his chest into Jackson's midsection. It was like being hit by a battering ram. 80 pounds of muscle propelled by pure desperation. Jackson flew backward, his feet leaving the ground. He crashed through the open glass door, landing hard on the wet grass outside. The air left his lungs in a painful whoosh. He lay there gasping, clutching his bleeding arm, staring up at the open door. Gunner stood in the threshold. He was panting heavily, blood dripping from his muzzle, Jackson's blood. He looked like a monster, a beast gone rogue. But then Jackson saw his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a killer. They were the eyes of a martyr. Gunner wasn't looking at Jackson with hatred. He was looking past him. He was looking at the roof of the warehouse adjacent to the kennel. Gunner barked once. A single sharp command. "Go." Before Jackson could process what was happening, the night exploded with light. Floodlights from the roof of the mansion and the warehouse clicked on simultaneously, turning the backyard into high noon. Sirens wailed, piercing the silence. And then a sound that Jackson knew too well, the sharp crack of a high-velocity rifle. A bullet slammed into the concrete floor of the kennel exactly where Jackson had been standing 2 seconds ago. Jackson froze, his blood running cold. If Gunner hadn't hit him, if Gunner hadn't forced him out of that cage with a violence that felt like betrayal, that bullet would be in his chest. Gunner hadn't attacked him. Gunner had cleared the kill zone. Freeze. Police. Drop to the ground. Voices shouted from the darkness. Tactical lights swept across the lawn, blinding Jackson. He saw uniformed officers swarming the perimeter, weapons drawn. And behind them, moving calmly through the chaos, came Councilman Sterling, flanked by two large men in private security uniforms. Jackson couldn't move. His arm was throbbing, his body in shock. He stayed on the ground, raising his good hand, his bleeding arm held close to his chest. "I surrender." He choked out, spitting blood from his lip. Two officers were on him instantly. They grabbed his injured arm, wrenching it behind his back. Jackson cried out in pain as the handcuffs clicked shut. They dragged him to his knees, forcing his face into the mud. From his position on the ground, Jackson could see the kennel. Gunner was still standing in the doorway. He wasn't barking anymore. He was watching. He watched as the officers roughed Jackson up. He watched as Sterling approached, shaking his head with mock disappointment. "I warned you, Mr. Carter." Sterling said, his voice loud enough for the police to hear. "I told you that dog was dangerous. I told you he didn't know you anymore. Look at what he did to you. He nearly tore your arm off." Jackson looked up, spitting mud. "You tried to shoot me," he rasped. "There is a sniper on the roof. You are delusional." Sterling sighed, gesturing to the officers. "He broke into my property. He tried to steal my dog, and when the animal attacked him in self-defense, he started hallucinating about snipers. Get him out of here. He needs a hospital, and then he needs a cell." The officers hauled Jackson to his feet. He stumbled, dizzy from blood loss. As they dragged him toward the patrol cars, he twisted his head back for one last look at Gunner. A handler from Sterling's private security team had approached the dog. He held a catch pole, a long metal rod with a wire loop at the end. He jammed the loop over Gunner's head, tightening it around the collar. Gunner didn't fight. He didn't growl. He let the man drag him back into the glass cage. But as the door slid shut, locking him back inside his prison, Gunner looked directly at Jackson. The aggression was gone. The fear was gone. There was only a profound, heartbreaking sadness. The dog lowered his head and tapped the glass one last time. Clack, one tap. It was the end of the message. Over and out. Jackson felt a tear mix with the rain on his face. Gunner had saved his life. He had accepted the role of the villain. He had hurt the person he loved most in the world, just to push him out of the line of fire. It was the ultimate severity, the ultimate act of discipline. And now Jackson was being dragged away, leaving his partner behind in the hands of a man who would punish him for saving the intruder. "Wait!" Jackson screamed, struggling against the officers. "Wait! Check the collar! Check the damn collar! It is not a collar! It is a weapon! Stop resisting," one of the officers shouted, slamming Jackson against the side of the cruiser. "I am not resisting," Jackson yelled, his voice breaking. "I am telling you, he saved me. He pushed me out. Check the ballistics. There is a bullet hole in the floor of that cage. That is enough, son." Sheriff Brody stepped out of the shadows. He looked tired and old. "Just get in the car, Jackson. You have done enough damage tonight," Brody Jackson pleaded, looking his old coach in the eye. "You know me. You know I am a marksman. Look at the angle. I was standing inside. The dog bit me and threw me out. Why would he do that if he wanted to kill me? He would have gone for the throat and held on. He pushed me, Brody. He cleared the zone." Brody paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes flickering toward the kennel where Sterling was now talking to the security guard. But then the fear returned. The fear of power. The fear of losing his pension. "Get him out of here," Brody ordered, turning away. They shoved Jackson into the back seat. The door slammed shut, sealing him in the cage of the police car. Through the wire mesh of the window, he watched as the lights of the estate faded into the distance. He looked down at his arm. The bandage the paramedics had hastily applied was soaked through with red. The bite was deep. It would leave a scar, a permanent reminder of this night. But Jackson didn't feel anger. He felt a cold, burning resolve. Gunner had bought him time. Gunner had kept him alive, and Jackson wasn't going to waste that gift. He leaned his head against the window, watching the rain streak the glass. He tapped his finger against the plastic door panel. Clack, clack, clack. "I am still here, buddy," he whispered. "I am still here." He wasn't defeated. He was just regrouping. Sterling thought he had won. He thought he had discredited the crazy veteran and locked away the only witness. But he had made a mistake. He had let Jackson live. And he had underestimated the bond between a Marine and his dog. Jackson closed his eyes, listening to the siren wail. He pictured the x-ray machine in Emily's clinic. He pictured the evidence he needed. He just had to get out of this cell. He just had to get Gunnar to that clinic. The war wasn't over. It had just moved to a new battlefield, and Jackson Carter was ready to burn the whole world down to get his dog back. The holding cell smelled of bleach and stale sweat, a cold, sterile box designed to strip away a man's dignity hour by hour. Jackson sat on the thin metal cot, his head hanging low. The bandage on his arm was throbbing a rhythmic pulse of pain that synced with the pounding in his head, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the image that kept looping in his mind. Gunnar standing in the rain, Gunnar tapping the glass, Gunnar's eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it felt human. Jackson clenched his good hand into a fist until the knuckles turned white. He had failed. He had tried to be the hero, he had tried to break the cycle, but all he had done was get himself thrown in a cage while his partner remained trapped in a glass prison. The heavy steel door at the end of the corridor buzzed loudly, echoing off the concrete walls. Footsteps approached, clicking sharply against the linoleum. Not the heavy thud of boots, but the purposeful stride of someone who refused to be intimidated. Jackson didn't look up until the shadow fell across the bars of his cell. "Open it," a female voice commanded. It wasn't a request. The deputy grumbled something about protocol, but the keys jingled and the lock disengaged with a heavy clank. The door swung open. Dr. Emily Chen stepped inside. She wasn't wearing her usual scrubs. She was dressed in a sharp blazer holding a leather portfolio like a shield. She waited until the deputy retreated down the hall before her posture softened. She looked at Jackson, at the dried mud on his face and the blood seeping through the bandage on his forearm. "You look like hell, Marine," she said softly, sitting on the edge of the cot beside him. Jackson let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You should see the other guy. Or maybe you shouldn't. I don't think he has a scratch on him." Emily didn't laugh. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small antiseptic wipe, reaching for his arm. Jackson flinched, but let her clean the wound around the bandage. "I told them I am your court-appointed psychiatric advocate," she whispered, working quickly. "I told them you had a PTSD episode and needed immediate stabilizing, or I would sue the department for neglecting a decorated veteran. They gave me 10 minutes. Jackson leaned his head back against the cold cinder block wall. "Why bother, Emily? It is over. Sterling won. He has the dog. He has the law. And I am sitting here waiting to be charged with breaking and entering assault and probably attempted theft. Gunnar saved my life tonight, but nobody could... They just see a vicious animal and a crazy soldier." "He saved your life," Emily repeated, her hands pausing. "You are sure about that?" "He pushed me out of the kill zone," Jackson said, his voice breaking. "There was a sniper on the roof. I saw the bullet hit the floor. Gunnar knew. He knew before I did. He bit me to make me move." Emily finished taping the dressing and sat back, her dark eyes locking onto his. "Then you need to listen to me very carefully, Jackson, because you didn't fail tonight. You just found the missing piece of the puzzle." Jackson frowned, looking at her. "What are you talking about?" "I followed you," Emily said quietly. "I parked half a mile down the road. When I saw the floodlights come on and heard the sirens, I hiked up to the perimeter wall. I couldn't get in, but I didn't need to. I had the scanner." Jackson straightened up, the fog of despair lifting slightly. "The scanner. You used it. I turned it on the second the police cruisers arrived," Emily said, her voice dropping even lower. "I pointed it straight at the kennel. The chaos, the sirens, the radios, usually that much interference scrambles a signal. But this signal, Jackson, it was strong. It was piercing. And it wasn't a training collar frequency," Emily said. "Standard shock collars operate on a 27 megahertz band. Simple radio waves, short range. But the signal coming from Gunnar's neck was 402 megahertz. Jackson stared at her blankly. "What does that mean?" 402 to 405 megahertz is the Mike's band," Emily explained, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and scientific fascination. "Medical implant communication service. It is a reserved frequency, Jackson. It is used exclusively for high-tech medical implants, pacemakers, defibrillators, insulin pumps, devices that need to talk to a controller outside the body without interference." The air in the cell seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jackson felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Medical implants," he whispered. "Sterling isn't shocking him," Emily said grimly. "He isn't using electricity to burn his skin. That collar is a transmitter." It is talking to something inside Gunner's body, something surgical. Jackson's mind flashed back to the X-ray vision of his memory, the way Gunner moved, the way he froze, the way he tapped his chest. Inside his body, Jackson repeated the horror dawning on him. You mean he put something inside the dog? I don't know what it is, Emily admitted. But if it is on a cardiac frequency, it is tied to his heart, and if Sterling has a remote that controls it, he can manipulate Gunner's heart rate. He can slow it down until the dog passes out, or he can speed it up until his heart explodes. Jackson finished the sentence, his stomach churning with bile. That is why Gunner couldn't leave with you, Emily said, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't just obedience. If he leaves the range of that transmitter, or if his heart rate spikes from running or excitement, the device might be programmed to trigger a fail-safe. He stays calm because staying calm keeps him alive. Jackson stood up, pacing the small cell like a caged animal. The rage that had been simmering all night boiled over into a cold, focused fury. This wasn't abuse. This was torture. This was biological warfare waged on a dog. We have to get him out, Jackson said, turning to Emily. I don't care about the charges. I don't care about jail. We have to get that thing out of him. That is why I am here, Emily said, standing up and smoothing her blazer. I didn't just come to bandage you up. I made a deal with Sheriff Brody. A deal. I told him that since Gunner bit a human, the county requires a mandatory rabies quarantine and health assessment. By law, the dog cannot stay at the owner's home if there is a suspicion of unstable behavior. He has to be evaluated by a licensed third-party veterinarian. Jackson stopped pacing. You. Me? Emily nodded. Brody signed the order 5 minutes ago. Sterling is furious, but he can't fight a public health mandate without looking suspicious. He is bringing Gunner to my clinic in 1 hour. He is bringing his lawyers and his guards, but he is bringing the dog. Jackson grabbed her shoulders, his eyes burning with intensity. You are going to X-ray him. I am going to X-ray him. I am going to scan him, and I am going to find whatever piece of hell Sterling buried in that dog's body, Emily vowed. But I need you there, Jackson. I need you to keep Gunner calm. If his heart rate spikes during the exam and that device triggers, I might lose him on the table. I am a prisoner, Jackson said, gesturing to the bars. I can't leave. Emily pulled a folded piece of paper from her portfolio. Temporary custody release for medical consultation, she said, a small triumphant smile touching her lips. Brody knows something is wrong, Jackson. He is scared of Sterling, but he is a cop. He saw the bullet hole in the floor. He wants to know the truth, too. He just needs us to prove it. The heavy door at the end of the hall buzzed again. Let's go, Marine Emily said, opening the cell door. We have a patient to save. Jackson stepped out of the cell, the pain in his arm forgotten. He wasn't a prisoner anymore. He was a man with a target, and this time he knew exactly what he was looking for. The war wasn't over. It had just moved to the operating table. The veterinary clinic had transformed from a place of healing into a high-security zone within the span of an hour. The parking lot, usually empty at this time of night, was now dominated by 3 black SUVs, their engines idling with a low, menacing rumble that vibrated through the clinic walls. Jackson stood in the corner of the examination room, his hands cuffed loosely in front of him, flanked by Sheriff Brody, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else on Earth. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and impending violence. Emily Chen stood by the metal examination table, her face a mask of professional steel, though Jackson could see the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted the lead apron. She was risking her career, her license, and possibly her life for a dog she hadn't seen in years, but she didn't back down. The front door chimed, not a welcoming sound, but a signal that the enemy had breached the perimeter. Councilman Sterling entered first. He wasn't wearing the silk robe from the night before. He was dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly in place, looking every bit the grieving owner of a troubled animal, but his eyes were cold, dead things that scanned the room with contempt. Behind him, 2 large men in dark suits dragged Gunner inside. Jackson's breath hitched in his throat. Gunner was muzzled. A heavy leather strap bound his jaws shut, pressing into his snout so hard the skin was white around the edges. He was walking, but just barely. His legs were stiff, his head hung low, and his tail was tucked so far between his legs it was touching his stomach. The diamond-studded collar was still there, pulsating with that faint, invisible menace that only Jackson and Emily knew about. Sterling stopped in the middle of the room, looking at Emily with a sneer. "This is harassment, Doctor," he said, his voice smooth but laced with venom. "My dog is not rabid. He was defending his home from a trespasser. I have half a mind to have this clinic shut down for malpractice." Emily didn't flinch. She picked up a clipboard, her voice steady and loud enough for the sheriff to hear. "Under County Ordinance 4, Section 9, any animal that inflicts a bite wound breaking the skin must be surrendered for a mandatory 48-hour observation and neurological assessment to rule out rabies or aggression caused by brain trauma. It is not a request, Councilman. It is the law. And unless you wanted the state health department raiding your estate to seize him, you will put the dog on the table." Sterling's jaw tightened. He looked at Brody, waiting for the sheriff to intervene to bend the rules like he always did. But Brody just stared at the floor, shifting his weight. He had seen the bullet hole in the kennel floor. He knew Jackson wasn't lying about the sniper. For the first time in years, the sheriff was choosing his badge over his benefactor. "Fine," Sterling spat. He snapped his fingers at the guards. "Put him up. But nobody touches the collar. It is a specialized therapeutic device for his anxiety. If you remove it, he becomes uncontrollable." Jackson stepped forward instinctively, his chains rattling. "You mean if we remove it, you lose control?" he growled. One of the guards shoved Jackson back against the wall, his hand hovering over a concealed weapon. Gunner heard the rattle of the chains. His head snapped up, his eyes locking onto Jackson. For a second, the tail twitched, a tiny spark of joy, but then the collar buzzed, a low, audible hum that made everyone in the room freeze. Gunner flinched violently, his eyes rolling back in his head as he slumped against the guard's leg, trembling. Emily stepped in between them, her hand raised. "Stop it," she ordered. "Get him on the table now. His heart rate is spiking." The guards lifted the 80-pound dog onto the steel table. Gunner lay there limp and terrified, his chest heaving like a bellows. Emily moved quickly, pressing her stethoscope to his side. She listened for only a second before pulling away, her face pale. "His heart rate is over 180, she whispered to Jackson. "It's too high. If it goes any higher, whatever that device is might trigger." Jackson forced himself to calm down. He forced his breathing to slow, knowing that Gunner was feeding off his energy. If Jackson was angry, Gunner was anxious. If Jackson was calm, Gunner might survive. He closed his eyes, projecting every ounce of peace he could muster. "Easy, buddy," Jackson murmured softly, his voice a low rumble. "We are just at the vet. Just a checkup. Tango Mike, stay cool." The sound of his voice seemed to anchor the dog. Gunner's breathing hitched, then slowed. He didn't look at Jackson, but he leaned imperceptibly toward the sound, seeking the safety of his partner's presence. Emily nodded, signaling that the danger zone had passed for now. She reached for the overhead X-ray arm, pulling it down over Gunner's trembling body. "I need to do a full body scan to check for internal injuries from the altercation," she lied smoothly. "Everyone needs to step back behind the lead shield." Sterling narrowed his eyes, suspicious. "You don't need an X-ray for a bite assessment." "I do if I want to prove he isn't brain damaged," Emily countered, pushing the button on the console. "Unless you have something to hide, Councilman." Sterling hesitated. He looked at the machine, then at the collar. He clearly didn't know enough about veterinary medicine to know what an X-ray would show, but his arrogance was his weakness. He believed his technology was invisible. He believed he was untouchable. "Make it quick." He snapped, checking his watch. "I have a flight in 2 hours." Emily stepped behind the glass partition, beckoning Jackson to follow. The guards and Sterling stayed in the room, arms crossed, defiant, but foolishly exposing themselves to the radiation. Emily didn't warn them. She typed a command into the computer. The machine above Gunner whirred to life, a soft, mechanical hum that sounded like Judgment Day approaching. Jackson stood next to her, his eyes glued to the monitor. His heart was pounding so hard it hurt. This was it, the moment of truth. If they were wrong, if the collar was just a shot collar and Gunner was just a broken dog, then Jackson was going to prison for a long time. But if they were right... Emily's finger hovered over the capture button. "Hold still, Gunner," she whispered. She pressed the button. A sharp beep echoed through the room. The digital image began to render on the screen. First the white outline of the ribs, then the spine, then the skull, and finally the soft tissue. As the image sharpened into focus, Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jackson leaned in, his blood running cold. What he saw on that screen wasn't just metal and bone. It was a roadmap of cruelty so sophisticated, so evil, that it took his breath away. Sterling wasn't just controlling a dog, he had turned a living, breathing hero into a biological time bomb, and the timer was ticking. The hum of the X-ray machine cut through the silence like a saw blade as the digital image slowly rendered on the high-definition monitor. Jackson stood frozen, his eyes locked on the screen, his breath trapped in his chest. Beside him, Dr. Emily Chen leaned forward, her face bathed in the ghostly blue light of the display. For a moment, there was only the sound of the cooling fans whirring overhead. Then Emily let out a gasp that sounded like all the air had been punched out of her lungs. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror so profound it made the sheriff step closer, his hand instinctively dropping to his weapon. "Oh my God," Emily whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. "Jackson, look at the spine. Look at the vertebrae." Jackson forced himself to focus. He expected to see broken bones. He expected to see tumors or shrapnel from old war wounds, but what he saw made his blood run cold. Running along the length of Gunner's spine, woven intricately between the vertebrae like a second nervous system, were thin, translucent tubes. They were almost invisible against the bone, but under the high contrast of the X-ray, they glowed with a sinister, artificial brightness. "What is that?" Jackson asked, his voice hoarse. "Those aren't medical implants," Emily said, her voice rising in panic. "Those are reservoirs. Someone has surgically implanted high-grade polymer tubing inside his body cavity." She typed furiously on the keyboard, switching the view to a density scan. The tubes lit up in angry red, indicating fluid. Heavy, dense fluid. "This isn't medicine," Emily stated, flatly turning to face the room. "This is cargo." Sterling shifted his weight, his composure cracking for the first time. The smooth politician mask slipped, revealing the cold, calculating eyes of a predator. "You are imagining things, Doctor," he scoffed, though a bead of sweat trickled down his temple. "That is experimental spinal support. The best money can buy." Emily shouted, pointing at the screen. "That is liquid red mercury. I saw the briefing papers on this stuff when I was deployed. It is a binary liquid explosive. Highly unstable, highly valuable, and completely undetectable by standard airport scanners because it looks like biological fluid on a density check." The room went deathly silent. Sheriff Brody stared at Sterling, his mouth slightly open, processing the magnitude of the accusation. "You are using him as a mule." Jackson realized the horror washing over him. "You are using a war hero as a living, breathing smuggling container." "It makes perfect sense," Emily said, her voice shaking with rage. "Who checks a retired military working dog at the airport? Who scans a hero? They get expedited screening. They walk right through the metal detectors. You could smuggle millions of dollars of this stuff right under the nose of the TSA inside the body of a dog everyone wants to pet." But the horror on the screen didn't stop at the spine. Emily zoomed in on the neck where the diamond-studded collar sat heavy and tight. On the X-ray, the collar wasn't just leather and gel. It was a complex nest of circuitry wires and sensors, and from the collar, two thin needles extended downwards, piercing the skin and resting millimeters from the jugular vein. Jackson saw the connection immediately. The wires from the collar didn't just stop at the skin, they communicated with the tubes in the spine. "What is the collar for?" Jackson asked, though he felt sick knowing the answer. Emily traced the wiring on the screen with a shaking finger. "It is a biomonitor, Jackson. It is connected to his heart rate. See this sensor here? It is reading his pulse in real time. And this mechanism here by the needles, it is a solenoid trigger." She turned to Jackson, tears streaming down her face. "It is a fail-safe. If his heart rate goes above a certain threshold, the device triggers. It injects a catalyst into his bloodstream. It would kill him instantly. Or worse, it would detonate the liquid in his spine." Jackson looked at Gunner lying motionless on the table, his eyes squeezed shut in terror. He thought back to the gate. He thought back to every moment he had seen his dog in the last week. The rejection, the growling, the way Gunner had refused to wage his tail. "He didn't forget me," Jackson whispered, his voice breaking. "He was saving himself." Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. "The threshold is probably set to 120 beats per minute. The heart rate of a calm, resting dog. If he gets excited, if he runs, if he sees the person he loves most in the world and his heart starts to race with joy, he dies." Jackson finished the sentence, the devastation hitting him like a physical blow. Gunnar knew. Somehow the dog had learned that happiness was a death sentence. He had learned that the feeling of love, the rapid pounding of his heart when he saw Jackson, was the trigger that would end his life. So he had suppressed it. He had forced himself to be calm. He had forced himself to be aggressive because aggression was controlled, but joy was chaotic. Every snarl at the gate had been a desperate attempt to keep his heart rate down. Every time he pushed Jackson away, he was fighting his own biology, fighting the overwhelming urge to be happy just to stay alive. He had lived in a prison of emotional suppression, terrified that a single wag of his tail would kill him. Jackson looked at Sterling with a hatred so pure it blinded him. "You monster!" he growled, stepping forward, his fists clenched. "You made him afraid to love. You made him afraid to be happy." Sterling stepped back, pulling a small black remote from his jacket pocket. His face was twisted in a sneer, the pretense of civility gone. "It is called conditioning. Mr. Carter." Sterling spat, his voice dripping with disdain. It took months to break him, to teach him that excitement equals pain. But he learned. He is a good soldier, better than you ever were. He carries the payload, and he keeps his mouth shut. Sterling held up the remote, his thumb hovering over a red button. "And now you have ruined it. You have compromised the asset." Sheriff Brody drew his weapon, his hands steady. "Put the remote down, Sterling. Now." "You don't understand," Sheriff Sterling laughed, a manic edge to his voice. "This isn't just a remote. It is a dead man's switch. If my heart stops, or if I press this button, the collar triggers, the dog dies. And considering the amount of explosive material inside him, this entire clinic becomes a crater." Emily froze her hand, hovering over the console. "He is right," she whispered. "The density of that liquid. If it detonates, it will take out the block." Jackson looked at Gunnar. The dog's eyes were open now, staring at Jackson. The tail gave a tiny involuntary twitch, and the monitor beeped rapidly as his heart rate spiked to 110. "Gunnar, no," Jackson said softly, forcing his own voice to be calm despite the terror screaming in his mind. "Stay calm, buddy. Stay with me." The dog whined a high-pitched sound of distress. He wanted to get up. He wanted to run to Jackson, but he knew. He remembered the pain. He remembered the training. Sterling backed toward the door, the remote held high. "I am leaving. I am," signed to the dog. "And if anyone follows me, if I see one police cruiser in my rearview mirror, I press this button. Do you hear me?" Jackson looked at the X-ray one last time. The needles, the tubes, the heart. He looked at Gunnar, the dog who had sacrificed his own happiness to survive, and he made a choice. "You are not taking him," Jackson said, his voice low and dangerous. Sterling sneered. "You want to bet your life on that Marine." "No," Jackson said, his eyes locking onto Gunnar's. "I am betting on his." Jackson didn't lunge at Sterling. He didn't run for the door. Instead, he dropped to his knees right there on the cold tile floor. He lowered his head and began to hum. It was a low, rhythmic sound, the same tune he used to hum in the trenches when the shelling was too loud and Gunnar was shaking with fear. It was their song, a lullaby for warriors. Gunnar's ears perked up. The frantic beeping of the heart monitor slowed. Beep, beep, beep. 105, 100, 95. Sterling looked confused, his thumb wavering on the button. "What are you doing? Stop that!" Jackson didn't stop. He kept humming, pouring every ounce of love and calm he possessed into the sound. He was telling Gunnar that it was okay to be calm, that he didn't need to fight, that Jackson was here and he would take the burden. Gunnar's eyes drooped, his breathing deepened. The tension left his body. He wasn't asleep, but he was in a trance, a state of deep connection with his handler. 90, 85, 80. Now Jackson shouted. Sheriff Brody didn't hesitate. He fired. Not at Sterling, but at the remote in his hand. The bullet shattered the plastic casing, sending the device flying across the room. Sterling screamed, clutching his hand. Gunnar didn't move. He didn't flinch. His heart rate stayed steady, anchored by Jackson's voice. But the collar began to beep. A shrill, continuous tone. The fail-safe. Without the signal from the remote, the collar was counting down. Emily screamed, "It is armed! We have 10 seconds!" Jackson lunged for the table, not to attack, but to hold. He wrapped his arms around Gunnar's neck, his fingers digging into the leather. "Cut it!" he yelled to Emily. "Cut the power!" Emily grabbed a pair of heavy trauma shears from the tray. She jammed them under the leather strap right against the dog's skin. 5 seconds. Sterling was scrambling for the door, blood dripping from his hand. Brody tackled him to the ground. 3 seconds. Jackson looked into Gunner's eyes. "I love you," he whispered. Emily squeezed the handles with both hands, using all her strength. 1 second. Snap! The collar fell away, clattering onto the metal table. The beeping stopped. Silence filled the room. Heavy, thick, miracle silence. Jackson slumped against the table, burying his face in Gunner's fur. He waited for the explosion. He waited for the end. But there was only the sound of Gunner's steady, strong heart beating against his chest. Alive! They were alive. Gunner lifted his head free of the weight for the first time in years. He looked at the broken collar on the table. Then he looked at Jackson. And then slowly, tentatively, his tail began to wag. Thump, thump, thump against the metal table. It was the loudest sound Jackson had ever heard. The silence in the examination room shattered the moment Councilman Sterling realized there was no way out. The ghostly image on the X-ray monitor was glowing like a neon sign of his guilt, exposing the intricate web of tubes and wires threaded through the body of the war hero lying on the table. For a split second, the politician's mask of sophistication dissolved completely, revealing the cornered rat beneath. His eyes darted from the damning screen to the horrified face of Dr. Chen, and finally to the sheriff, whose hand was already reaching for his holster. Sterling knew the game was over. The smuggling ring, the millions of dollars, the reputation he had built on the backs of exploited veterans and their dogs, it was all incinerating in the heat of this revelation. But Sterling was a man who believed in scorched earth tactics. If he was going down, he was taking the evidence and everyone else with him. "You think you have won!" Sterling hissed, his voice trembling with a manic energy. "You think you can just arrest me and walk away. You have no idea what you are dealing with. This isn't just contraband. It is volatile, and it is tied to me." His hand plunged into his jacket pocket. Sheriff Brody shouted a warning, lunging forward, but he was too slow. Sterling pulled out the black remote. It looked harmless, just a piece of plastic with a few buttons, but Jackson knew better. He had seen what it could do. He had seen it drop an 80-pound animal to the ground in terror. But this time, Sterling didn't press the button for sit or down. He flipped a small safety cover on the side of the device and jammed his thumb down on a recessed red switch. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. A high-pitched electronic whine erupted from the collar around Gunner's neck, a sound so piercing it made everyone in the room flinch. The heart monitor connected to Gunner began to scream a frantic staccato rhythm that matched the sudden, violent thrashing of the dog on the table. Gunner didn't just wake up. He convulsed. His back arched off the steel table, his legs kicking out in a chaotic rhythm of pure neurological panic. His jaws snapped open and closed, biting at the air, biting at the pain that was suddenly flooding his system. He initiated the failsafe. Emily screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. He triggered the overload. The collar is stimulating his heart rate artificially. It is trying to force a cardiac arrest. Jackson didn't think. He didn't calculate. He moved. He broke from the corner of the room where he had been standing, ignoring the sheriff, ignoring the shouting, ignoring his own injuries. He launched himself toward the table, his only focus the seizing animal that had once saved his life in the desert. Sterling used the distraction to make his move. With the room focused on the dying dog, he shoved a rolling medical cart into Sheriff Brody, sending instruments clattering to the floor, and bolted for the door. "Stop him!" Emily yelled, grabbing a scalpel, but she was on the wrong side of the table. "Let him go," Jackson roared, throwing his body over Gunner. "Just let him go. We have to stop this." Jackson pressed his weight down on Gunner, trying to restrain the convulsions without hurting him. The dog was burning up. His fur felt hot to the touch, his muscles rigid as steel cables. The monitor was a blur of rising numbers. 160, 170, 180. "He is going to crash!" Emily cried, checking the pupils. "The device is pushing his heart too fast. If it hits 200, the liquid in his spine could destabilize from the body heat and the vibration. Jackson, if that red mercury blows, we are all dead." Jackson looked down at Gunner. The dog's eyes were rolling back in his head, the whites showing in stark terror. Foam was gathering at the corners of his mouth. But even through the seizure, even through the artificial storm ravaging his nervous system, Jackson saw a flicker of recognition. Gunner knew he was there, and Gunner was trying to push him away again. The dog let out a strangled, gargling growl, trying to snap at Jackson's hands. He was trying to protect his handler one last time. He knew he was a bomb. He knew he was about to explode, and he wanted Jackson as far away as possible. No, Jackson whispered, his face pressed against the dog's neck right next to the vibrating collar of death. No more pushing me away. We do this together. Jackson looked at Emily, his eyes wild but focused. How do we stop it? How do we kill the signal? I can't override it from here. Emily shouted, her hands flying over the medical equipment, trying to find a frequency jammer. The signal is locked in. The remote is the master key. If he took it with him, we can't stop the transmission. Then we have to stop the heart, Jackson said. Not stop it. Slow it. We have to lower his heart rate below the trigger threshold. We have to calm him down manually. It is impossible, Emily said, tears streaming down her face. The collar is pumping adrenaline signals directly into his vagus nerve. He is in a chemical panic loop. He is a Marine. Jackson shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. And so am I. We don't panic. We adapt. Jackson grabbed Gunner's head, forcing the dog to look at him. He ignored the snapping jaws. He ignored the risk of losing a finger or his face. He pinned Gunner's gaze with his own. Look at me, Gunner. Look at me. Tango, Mike. Target marked. The command cut through the haze of pain. Gunner's thrashing slowed for a fraction of a second. The military discipline buried deep in his brain responded to the call sign. Jackson took a deep breath, inhaling the smell of fear and ozone. He started to hum. It wasn't a melody. It was a rhythm, low, deep, a vibration in his chest that transferred directly into the dog's body. It was the rhythm of a resting heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. Jackson ordered, his voice dropping to a soothing, hypnotic timbre. Breathe with me. In, out. You are safe. You are off duty. Stand down, soldier. Stand down. The heart monitor beeped frantically. 190, 195. It was hovering at the red line, the breaking point. Sterling had escaped the sound of his car tires screeching in the parking lot, echoing faintly outside. But in that room, the world had shrunk down to a man and his dog fighting a battle against biology and technology. Jackson closed his eyes and poured every memory of peace, every moment of love, every quiet night they had spent together into his hands. He massaged the pressure points behind Gunner's ears the way he used to after a patrol. I am here, Jackson whispered. I am not leaving. If you go, I go. So you have to stay. You have to stay for me. Gunner let out a long, shuddering breath. His rigid legs twitched and then relaxed slightly. The frantic growling stopped, replaced by a high-pitched whine of struggle. He was fighting the machine. He was fighting the impulse to die. The monitor beeped. 190, 188. It's working, Emily whispered, staring at the screen in disbelief. He is fighting it. Keep going, Jackson. Don't stop. Jackson didn't stop. He pressed his forehead against Gunner's, burying his face in the fur. He sang the old lullaby, now the one he used to sing when the mortars were falling. A rough off-key song that meant safety. The room seemed to vibrate with the tension. The collar was still whining, still trying to force the heart to explode, but the heart of a war dog was stronger than a circuit board, and the bond between them was the strongest force in the room. 180, 175, but time was running out. The collar began to emit a secondary sound, a rapid beeping, the countdown. The remote signal was gone, so the device was initiating its final fail-safe. If the heart rate didn't drop to safe levels in seconds, it would detonate the charge manually. Jackson heard the beeping. He knew what it meant. He didn't move. He just held on tighter. I love you, buddy, he choked out. And then suddenly the door to the clinic burst open. Sheriff Brody stood there panting, his uniform torn, holding something in his hand. It was the remote. Shattered. Broken. But the battery pack was ripped out. I stopped him. Brody gasped. The collar's whine faltered. The signal was cut. But the internal mechanism was still engaged, spinning down. The heart rate was the only thing that mattered now. 150, 140. Gunner looked at Jackson. The fear in his eyes began to fade, replaced by a deep, exhausted trust. He took a breath. A real breath. 130. Come on, Jackson whispered. Come on. 125. The beeping of the collar slowed. The red light on the device flickered and turned to a steady amber. 120. Silence. The collar clicked loudly and disengaged. The needles retracted. The hum stopped. Gunner slumped onto the table, completely spent. The monitor settled into a steady, rhythmic beep. Jackson fell to his knees beside the table, his legs giving out. He buried his face in his hands and sobbed. Great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. They had done it. They had beaten the trap. Emily rushed forward, grabbing the trauma shears. She didn't wait for permission. She cut the leather strap and ripped the collar off Gunner's neck, throwing it across the room as if it were a venomous snake. "It's over," she whispered, checking Gunner's pulse manually. "He is stable. Jackson, he is stable." Jackson looked up, his eyes red and swollen. He reached out and touched Gunner's snout. The dog licked his fingers weakly, a slow, gentle lap of a tongue that said, "Everything. Thank you." The nightmare was over. The bomb was defused, and the hero was finally coming home. The high-pitched whine of the collar had turned into a frantic siren, a countdown to a detonation that would erase everything in the room. The heart monitor was a blur of noise, a staccato rhythm that matched the terrifying convulsions of the dog on the table. Gunner was burning up. His body felt like a furnace against Jackson's chest, his muscles locking and unlocking in spasms of chemically induced terror. The digital readout on the monitor flickered ominously. 150, 155. It was climbing. The device inside Gunner was pushing him toward the edge, trying to force the cardiac event that would trigger the liquid explosive. Jackson knew he had seconds, maybe less. He could hear the shouts outside the clinic, the sound of Sheriff Brody pursuing Sterling into the parking lot, but that world felt a million miles away. The only world that mattered was right here on this cold metal table. Jackson ignored the pain in his bitten arm, he ignored the blood soaking his sleeve, and he ignored the screaming instinct to run. He pressed his entire upper body over Gunner, pinning the thrashing animal with his weight, not to restrain him, but to ground him. He needed to break the panic loop. He needed to reach through the noise and the pain and the fear to find the soldier inside the dog. "Breathe, Gunner." Jackson whispered, his voice rough and wet with tears. "Just breathe." He moved his hands to the sides of Gunner's neck, avoiding the vibrating collar, finding the thick fur behind the ears. He began to massage the pressure points, deep, rhythmic circles. It was the same motion he had used in the sandbox when the mortars were falling and the ground was shaking. It was their anchor. He lowered his head until his lips were brushing the dog's ear. He started to hum. It was a low, gravelly sound, a vibration that resonated from his chest directly into Gunner's ribs. It wasn't a song. It was a rhythm, the rhythm of a slow, steady heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. Tango. Mike Jackson murmured, using their old call sign. "Target marked. The target is Peace, Gunner. The target is sleep. Stand down, soldier. Stand down." Gunner's eyes were rolling back, the whites flashing in the harsh light. His jaws snapped at the air, trying to fight an invisible enemy. But then he heard it. The voice. The hum. The command. It cut through the chemical storm in his brain. Jackson felt a subtle shift. The rigid tension in Gunner's spine wavered. The dog let out a long, ragged whine, a sound of pure exhaustion. "Stay with me," Jackson pleaded, tears dripping from his face onto Gunner's muzzle. "Don't you dare leave me. We survived the desert. We survived the separation. We are not dying here. Not like this. Look at me." Gunner's head lolled to the side, and for the first time the wild panic in his eyes focused. He saw Jackson. He saw the man he had waited for, the man he had protected by pretending to be a monster. The monitor beeped. 140. "It is working," Emily shouted, her voice tight with hope. "He is responding. Keep doing it, Jackson. Whatever you are doing, do not stop." Jackson didn't stop. He closed his eyes and visualized the heart inside the dog's chest. He visualized it slowing down, syncing with his own. He poured every ounce of his love, every ounce of his will into his hands. "You are safe," Jackson whispered. "Sterling is gone. The mission is over. You don't have to fight anymore. You can rest. Just rest." 135. The siren from the collar changed pitch. It was no longer rising. It was holding steady. The red light on the casing stopped flashing so fast. It was hesitating. Come on, Jackson urged, his voice a broken lullaby. Come on, buddy. Lower. Just a little lower. Gunnar took a breath. A real deep shuddering breath that filled his lungs. His legs stopped kicking. His head grew heavy in Jackson's hands. He wasn't passing out. He was surrendering. He was trusting Jackson to catch him. 130. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the air conditioner hum felt loud. Emily stood poised with the heavy trauma shears, her knuckles white as she gripped the handles. She was watching the numbers, waiting for the safe zone. If she cut too soon, the shock could spike the heart rate again and kill them all. She needed 120. She needed the green zone. 125. Gunnar licked his lips weakly. His tail gave a microscopic thump against the table. That is it, Jackson cried softly. That is it. Good boy. The best boy. 122. The beeping of the collar slowed down. The frantic urgency bled out of the sound, replacing it with a rhythmic warning tone. The device was checking the vitals, querying the biological system to see if the threat was gone. 120. Now Emily screamed. She didn't hesitate. She jammed the cold steel of the shears under the thick leather strap, pressing down hard against the dog's neck to get leverage. Gunnar didn't flinch. He just looked at Jackson, his eyes soft and heavy. Jackson held his breath, bracing for the explosion. Emily squeezed with both hands. There was a sickening crunch of plastic and wire, followed by the snap of heavy leather. The collar fell apart. The whining noise died instantly. The red light winked out. The heavy, dangerous weight slid off Gunnar's neck and clattered loudly onto the metal table, lying there like a dead snake. Silence rushed back into the room. Jackson didn't move. He kept his arms around Gunnar, waiting for the aftershock, waiting for the world to end. But the only sound was the steady rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. 115, 110. Stable. Emily dropped the shears, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. She let out a sob that sounded like a laugh. We did it, she whispered. The circuit is dead. He is safe. Jackson slowly lifted his head. He looked at Gunnar. The dog was lying still, exhausted but alive. The indentations from the collar were deep, angry red marks on his neck, but he was breathing. Gunnar blinked slowly. He looked at the broken collar on the table. Then he looked up at Jackson. He let out a soft huff of air and nudged Jackson's hand with his wet nose. Jackson buried his face in the dog's fur and wept. He cried for the years they had lost. He cried for the pain Gunnar had endured. And he cried because finally, after the long, dark night, the sun was about to rise. The soldier had come home. The heavy thud of the collar hitting the floor echoed like a gavel strike, ending a long nightmare. It lay there, wires exposed, leather torn, a dead thing that could no longer hurt anyone. At the door, the scuffle ended with the sharp click of handcuffs. Sheriff Brody hauled Councilman Sterling to his feet, the politician's expensive suit rumpled and stained. Sterling opened his mouth to threaten, to bribe, to scream, but Brody silenced him with a look of pure disgust. You are done, Councilman Brody said, his voice heavy with the weight of his own redemption. You are done, hurting heroes, as the deputies dragged the shouting man out into the night. The air in the room shifted. The toxicity was gone. Jackson turned back to the table. Gunnar was standing up now, his legs shaky but supporting his weight. He looked down at the broken collar. Then he looked up at Jackson. For years, Gunnar had lived in a prison of his own biology, afraid that a single tail wag would stop his heart. But now the fear was gone. The silence in his head was beautiful. He took a step forward. His tail gave a tentative thump, then another, and then the dam broke. Gunnar didn't just wag his tail, his entire body shook with a joy so pure it was blinding. He launched himself off the table, slamming into Jackson's chest, knocking the man backward onto the floor. But this time there was no growl. There was no bite. There were only frantic wet kisses covering Jackson's face. Gunnar whined a high-pitched sound of absolute freedom, nuzzling into Jackson's neck, licking away the salt of his tears. Jackson wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the thick fur, sobbing openly. You are free, buddy, he choked out, rocking back and forth on the cold tile. You can be happy now. You can just be a dog. Emily stood by the counter, tears streaming down her face, watching the two old soldiers hold each other. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were whole. 6 months later, the world looked different. The gray rain of Seattle had given way to the golden warmth of a summer afternoon. The water of the lake was a sheet of glass reflecting the deep blue of the sky. On the end of a weathered wooden dock, Jackson sat with a fishing pole in his hand. He looked different, too. The hollow look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet peace. The scars were still there, but they didn't hurt as much anymore. Beside him, Gunnar lay stretched out in the sun. He wasn't wearing a diamond collar. He wasn't wearing a tactical vest. He was wearing a simple red bandana loose around his neck. His coat was thick and shiny, the patches of burned skin long healed. A duck landed on the water nearby with a loud splash. Gunnar lifted his head, ears perked. He looked at the duck, then looked at Jackson. In the old days, that sound would have triggered a perimeter check. But today, Gunnar just let out a soft sigh and laid his head back down on his paws, closing his eyes. He didn't have to watch the wire. He didn't have to guard the gate. The war was finally over. Jackson reached down, resting his hand on the dog's warm side, feeling the steady, strong beat of a heart that was finally allowed to love without fear. "Good boy," Jackson whispered to the water. "Good boy." And in the quiet of the afternoon, the only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves and the peaceful breathing of a hero at rest. The story of Jackson and Gunnar teaches us a profound lesson about the true nature of loyalty and the hidden depths of sacrifice. On the surface, it seemed like a tragedy of time and trauma, a war hero forgotten by his best friend, a dog turned vicious by age and illness. But the heartbreaking truth revealed something far more powerful. Sometimes the greatest act of love is not an embrace, but a push away. Gunnar's aggression wasn't born of hatred. It was born of protection. He knew that his own happiness was a trigger for destruction. To save himself and the man he loved, he had to suppress his very nature. He had to deny himself the joy of a wagging tail or a welcoming bark. This reminds us that love isn't always loud, visible, or easy to understand. Sometimes those who love us most are fighting silent battles we cannot see, making sacrifices we cannot imagine just to keep us safe. Furthermore, Jackson's journey reminds us of the importance of trusting our intuition over appearances. When the world told him his dog was gone, when authority figures told him to walk away, Jackson listened to the quiet, rhythmic truth of the tap code. He refused to abandon a soul he had sworn to protect. In a world that is often quick to discard the broken, the old, or the dangerous, Jackson showed us that true devotion means looking past the surface to find the spirit trapped underneath. Ultimately, this story is a testament to the unbreakable bond between a handler and his canine. It proves that while wires and technology can control a heartbeat, they can never conquer a heart. Evil may try to exploit innocence, but it will always be defeated by the relentless, stubborn power of love that refuses to give up. If Gunnar's incredible sacrifice brought a tear to your eye, please hit the like button and share this story to honor all the silent heroes out there. And tell us in the comments, have you ever had a dog that you felt understood you better than any human? We'd love to hear your story.